No wheels, no horses, no oxen, no written language, not a single symbol scratched onto bark or bone that history has yet been able to recover. And yet, 2,000 years ago, in the forests and river valleys of what is now Ohio, something happened that modern engineers still struggle to fully explain. They moved 500 million tons of earth. Not 5 million. Not 50 million, 500 million. Basket by basket, carried by human hands, through mud and heat and ice, across terrain, where rivers flooded without warning, and winters came early and stayed long. They shaped that earth into forms so geometrically precise, perfect circles, perfect octagons, alignments so exact, they had to be measured by satellite before anyone fully believed them, that modern surveyors, when they first ran their instruments across the ruins, assumed their equipment was malfunctioning. It wasn't. Tonight, we are going somewhere most Americans have never heard of, to meet a civilization most American history books never adequately described. A people who built no pyramids of stone, who left no Colosseum crumbling against a European skyline, who sent no armadas across the Atlantic, and who, for exactly those reasons, disappeared almost completely from the story the modern world tells itself about the ancient past. The Hopewell Culture, 2,000 years ago, in Ohio. At its height, this civilization maintained trade networks stretching across the entire North American continent. Copper mined at the edge of Lake Superior arrived in burial chambers in Louisiana. Obsidian from the volcanic fields of Yellowstone, more than 1,500 miles away, was worked into razor-edged tools in Ohio river valleys. Shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico. Mica from the mountains of North Carolina, freshwater pearls, ceremonial pipes carved in the shapes of birds and animals now extinct. All of it moving through a web so vast, so organized, so deliberate that archaeologists call it not a trade network, but a world system. And at the center of that world, they built something that defies easy description. Geometric earthworks covering 4 square miles of landscape, aligned to celestial cycles that require decades of observation just to understand. Enclosures large enough to fit 4 Roman colosseums inside them. A road, straight as a laser beam, 60 miles long, cutting through hills and forests and wetlands, as though the terrain did not exist. They didn't just build mounds. They rewrote the geometry of the earth itself. And then, somewhere around 400 AD, without obvious catastrophe, without the ash of conquest or the archaeology of plague, the building stopped. The road fell silent. The Continental Web unraveled. And the civilization that produced it faded so completely that, centuries later, European settlers standing among the ruins genuinely believed they had been built by a lost race. Perhaps giants, perhaps wandering Aztecs, perhaps a vanished white tribe, because it seemed impossible that the indigenous peoples of North America could have made them. They were wrong about that. And the truth is far more interesting than any of their theories, because this is not a story about a lost civilization. It is a story about a civilization that history chose to lose, one that built mathematical perfection into the Ohio landscape 2,000 years ago, while the Roman Empire was still deciding which provinces to conquer next. It is a story about what gets remembered and what gets buried. And it is a story that begins, as so many American mysteries do, with someone standing in a field that does not look like much, until you know what you're standing on. Begin with the image most people carry when they hear the words ancient Native American culture. Scattered villages, small fires, people living close to the land, barely surviving the winters, hunting and gathering through empty wilderness. It is not a malicious image, necessarily, but it is a profoundly incomplete one, and nowhere does it fail more completely than in southern Ohio, in the river valleys where the Hopewell people chose, 2,000 years ago, to build their world. The word chose matters here, because what the Hopewell built was not accidental accumulation. It was not the slow, organic growth of a community doing what it needed to survive. What they built required planning on timescales that extend across human generations. It required mathematics. It required engineering knowledge that had to be developed, codified, and transmitted across decades without the aid of written language. And it required a social system capable of coordinating the labor of thousands of people over centuries toward a single, sustained, extraordinary vision. That is not the image most people carry, but it is what the ground remembers. The Hopewell culture emerged roughly 2,000 years ago, around 100 BC, and reached its peak between about 100 and 400 AD. Centered in what is now southern Ohio. The name Hopewell comes not from any name these people called themselves, which is not known, but from Mordecai Hopewell, an Ohio farmer on whose land one of the first major mound complexes was excavated in the 1890s. It is a quietly absurd historical accident, a civilization of continental scale named for a 19th century landowner. And it tells you something about how thoroughly this civilization had been erased from popular understanding by the time science finally came looking. Who were they? The honest answer is that archaeology can tell us an enormous amount about what the Hopewell people built and traded and buried, and considerably less about how they spoke, what they called themselves, how they governed, or what they believed in the intimate daily sense. They left no Rosetta Stone, no hieroglyphic walls, no library. What they left was the earth itself, shaped by human intention into forms that survived 2 millennia of weather, erosion, and, in many cases, the heavy machinery of modern development. They were not, it must be said, immediately and emphatically, a simple people. That framing still appears in popular culture with frustrating regularity, as though complexity in ancient societies requires written language or stone architecture to be legitimate. The Hopewell were hunter-gatherers who also farmed, traders who also built astronomical observatories, engineers who also created art of extraordinary delicacy and skill. Their copperwork, hammered cold into sheets and cut into precise geometric forms, appears in museum cases today as some of the finest metalwork produced anywhere in the ancient world during the same period. The earthworks they built, which are the center of this story, come in several forms. There are burial mounds, rounded, gentle hills that contain the remains of important individuals, surrounded by objects of astonishing rarity and beauty. There are geometric enclosures, vast open spaces enclosed by walls of piled earth, sometimes reaching 6, 8, 10 feet high, shaped into circles and squares and octagons with a precision we will return to in considerable detail. And there are the roads, the most mysterious constructions of all. To understand the scale of what was built, it helps to start with numbers, and then to immediately try to feel what those numbers mean in human terms. The Newark Earthworks in Licking County, Ohio, the largest of the surviving Hopewell complexes, covered more than 4 square miles at their peak. The Great Circle alone, one component of the Newark complex, measures more than 1,200 feet in diameter. You could fit the Roman Colosseum inside it, and still have room to walk a comfortable lap around the interior. And to build these structures, every single cubic foot of earth was moved by a human being carrying a basket. No wheels. Remember that. No pack animals. No mechanical advantage of any kind beyond a simple digging tool, deer antler probably, or a fire-hardened wooden implement, and a container woven from plant fiber. Researchers estimate that the Newark complex alone required the movement of somewhere between 7 and 9 million cubic feet of earth. If you filled a standard dump truck to capacity, about 14 cubic yards, and drove it away, and refilled it, and drove it away again, you would need to do that approximately 400,000 times to move the same amount of material, by human hands and woven baskets. Over centuries, the question that naturally follows is, why? What justified this expenditure of human energy on a scale that rivals the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, in an era when simple survival was never far from anyone's daily calculation? The answer, or at least part of it, has to do with the purpose the earthworks seem to have served, and that purpose was not defensive, not agricultural, not primarily residential. It was ceremonial, cosmological. The earthworks appear to have been built as sacred space, as physical embodiments of a spiritual worldview, as places where the boundaries between the living world, the world above, and the world below could be approached, addressed, and, perhaps, opened. Inside the burial mounds, the objects tell a story of a society with profound spiritual complexity. Thousands of freshwater pearls, sometimes covering the bodies of the dead like blankets. Platform pipes, carved from Ohio pipestone in the shapes of animals, otters, frogs, ravens, hawks, with such anatomical precision that ornithologists and zoologists can identify the species. Sheets of beaten copper cut into the silhouettes of hands, birds, abstract symbols, effigy figures in fired clay, ceremonial blades of knife river flint from present-day North Dakota, 6 inches long and paper thin, so finely worked they could not have been practical tools. They were made to be buried, made to accompany the dead into whatever came next. Somewhere at the end of a long generation of construction, somewhere around the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, the people standing inside the Newark earthworks had created something that would not be fully understood for nearly 2,000 years. They had built a machine for reading the sky. But that revelation belongs to a later chapter. For now, stand at the edge of the Great Circle. As it might have looked at its peak, the earthen walls rise above your head, 6 feet, 8 feet, more in places, enclosing a space so large that the far wall appears to curve with the earth itself. The interior is flat and open, prepared with care, a sacred ground where thousands could gather. Behind you, another enclosure connects through a narrow gateway, and beyond that, if you could see far enough through the forest, a road, straight, impossibly straight, leading towards something 60 miles away. Those who gathered here were not simply building monuments. They were building a connection, not just between communities, but between the earth beneath their feet and something far larger. And to understand what that connection was, we have to walk the road. There is a moment in the history of almost every great archaeological discovery when the significance of what is being found begins to reveal itself not in a single dramatic artifact, but in a pattern, a recurring shape, a repeating alignment, an improbability that occurs once, then twice, then so many times that coincidence becomes impossible. For the Hopewell, that moment came when researchers began to look not at the earthworks themselves, but at the space between them. Newark, Ohio, Chillicothe, Ohio, two of the most significant Hopewell ceremonial centers ever identified. Two places where the earth was piled into massive geometric enclosures, where the dead were buried with continental treasure, where thousands of people gathered for ceremonies that apparently required weeks or months of preparation. They are separated by roughly 60 miles of Ohio landscape, hills, rivers, forest, wetland, terrain that in the 1st century AD was not easily crossed under any circumstances. Between them, archaeologists found a road, not a path, not a game trail, a road, bounded on both sides by parallel earthen walls, the entire corridor measuring almost 200 feet from edge to edge, wider than a modern interstate highway. For 60 miles, this road ran through the Ohio landscape without significant deviation. It climbed hills without going around them. It crossed wetlands without diverting from its heading. When researchers plotted its trajectory on modern survey maps and ran the numbers, the results were startling. Over its entire 60-mile length, the Great Hopewell Road deviates from a perfectly straight line by less than the width of a standard city street. Let that settle for a moment. 60 miles. No compass in the modern sense. No theodolite. No GPS. No satellite imagery. No aerial observation of any kind, because the terrain through which the road passes makes it impossible to see from one end to the other, from any point on the ground. And yet, straight. Straighter, in fact, than many roads built by societies that did have all of those tools. How? This question has occupied researchers for decades, and the honest answer is that no one knows with certainty. Several methods have been proposed, each of them plausible, none of them definitively confirmed by the archaeological record. One theory involves the use of astronomical sightlines, using the positions of stars or the sun to maintain a bearing across terrain where direct sighting is impossible. The ancient Egyptians used similar techniques to align their monuments. The builders of Stonehenge appear to have understood celestial geometry in ways that still impress modern astronomers. Another theory involves a relay system, a chain of human surveyors positioned along hilltops, each one visible from the previous, maintaining the heading across miles of difficult terrain. This would have required extraordinary organizational coordination, but it would also have been achievable with the social infrastructure the Hopewell clearly possessed, given the other evidence of their capacity for large-scale collective effort. A third possibility, raised by researchers studying the subtle topography of the road's route, is that the Hopewell surveyors found a naturally occurring alignment, perhaps a ridgeline, perhaps a seasonal flooding pattern, perhaps a feature of the landscape now lost to 2,000 years of change, and used it as their baseline. In this reading, the straightness of the road is not entirely the product of abstract geometric knowledge, but of an extraordinarily deep familiarity with a landscape that the Hopewell had been living in and observing for generations. Whatever the method, the achievement remains. 60 miles of road, straight enough to have been cut by a laser, built without wheels or beasts of burden through some of the most challenging terrain in eastern North America. But straightness is only the beginning of the road's mystery. The other question, perhaps the more interesting one, is what the road was for. And here, the archaeological evidence points in a direction that is simultaneously simple and profound. It was not built for commerce. The width of the road, nearly 200 feet, is wildly impractical for the movement of trade goods. Traders moving copper or obsidian or mica do not need a corridor wider than a football field. That kind of width is ceremonial. It is designed to move people in formation, in procession, in the ritualized, structured way that societies have always used to mark the transition between ordinary space and sacred space. The Great Hopewell Road, in this reading, was a pilgrimage route, a ceremonial highway connecting two of the most sacred sites in the Hopewell world, along which thousands of people may have walked, in specific seasons, at specific times, determined by the calendar, for specific ritual purposes, as part of a religious and social practice that held the Hopewell world together across the vast distances of eastern North America. This interpretation gains force when you examine what was happening at either end of the road. At Newark, one of the most remarkable ceremonial complexes ever built in North America, aligned with astronomical precision to the movements of the moon across a cycle that takes 18.5 years to complete. At Chillicothe, another complex of earthworks and burial mounds, another center of the continental trade network, another place where the earth was shaped into sacred geometry on a scale that still impresses 2 millennia later. The road connects them, and it connects them so precisely, so intentionally, so impossibly straight, that it seems less like a path from here to there, and more like a statement, a declaration in earth and effort, that these two places are not separate, that the distance between them is not an obstacle, but a sacred interval, a measured space within a larger cosmological order that the Hopewell understood in ways we are only beginning to recover. There is also something worth noting about the experience of walking such a road. Modern roads are designed to minimize the traveler's awareness of the journey, to collapse the distance between departure and arrival as efficiently as possible. A ceremonial road, bounded by earthen walls that rise above the traveler's head, works exactly the opposite way. It maximizes the awareness of movement. It marks every step as intentional. It creates a contained world within the landscape, a tunnel of sacred space through which the pilgrim moves in a state of heightened attention. Imagine walking that road 2,000 years ago. The walls rise on either side, cutting off the surrounding forest and creating a channel of sky above. The ground beneath your feet is prepared, swept, maintained. You have been walking for days. Ahead of you, the road continues straight to the horizon, unwavering, as though it were drawn by a hand larger than any human one. Behind you, the place you came from has long since disappeared. Ahead of you, something is waiting. You are being prepared for something. The road is doing that work. And what waited at the end of that road was not simply a collection of earthworks. It was an instrument, a device, built across 4 square miles of Ohio landscape, to measure something that moves in the sky above it, and to do so with a precision that would not be achieved again in the Western world for more than 1,000 years. In the history of mathematics, there is a problem so ancient and so fundamental that it occupied human minds from the time of the ancient Egyptians through the 17th century, when it was finally proven to be mathematically impossible. The problem is called squaring the circle. It asks, given a circle, can you construct a square with exactly the same area, using only a compass and a straight edge? The answer, as it turns out, is no. The ratio of a circle's area to its diameter involves the number pi, which is what mathematicians call transcendental. It cannot be expressed as a simple fraction, cannot be computed to a final decimal place, and therefore cannot be perfectly captured in the whole number ratios that govern the construction of a square. Squaring the circle is, in the strictest mathematical sense, impossible. And yet, in the Newark earthworks, it appears to have been done. The Newark complex consists of several major components. There is the Great Circle, a nearly perfect circular enclosure measuring 1,200 feet in diameter. There is the Octagon, an 8-sided enclosure of staggering scale. And there is the Square, a large quadrilateral enclosure whose interior area, when measured precisely, turns out to be essentially equal to the interior area of the Great Circle nearby. When surveyors first measured this relationship with modern instruments, many of them assumed it was coincidence. The Hopewell could not have known what pi was, at least not in the formal mathematical sense that later civilizations developed. But when researchers ran the numbers more carefully, the relationship held up across multiple measurements, from multiple starting points, accounting for erosion and 2,000 years of settlement on the landscape. The areas match, not approximately, not close enough to attribute to accident. They match within the precision limits of the earthworks themselves. The question this raises is not simply, how did they know, though that question is certainly interesting. The deeper question is what this mathematical relationship meant to the people who built it. What idea required squaring the circle to express? One possibility comes from the ceremonial roles the two shapes seem to have played. Circles and squares appear repeatedly in indigenous North American cosmology as representations of different aspects of the world. The circle as the sky, the celestial, the world of spirit; the square as the earth, the terrestrial, the world of physical existence. In many traditions, the alignment of these two forms represents a fundamental cosmic balance, the harmonization of the world above with the world below, the spiritual with the material, the eternal cycle with the fixed ground. If the Hopewell built their circle and square with equal areas, they may have been making precisely this statement in physical form, not as an abstract mathematical exercise, but as a cosmological declaration. We have measured the sky and the earth. We have found their equivalence. We have built that equivalence into the landscape so that it cannot be lost. The octagon, the 8-sided enclosure, adds another layer of complexity. Its interior encompasses about 50 acres. Its walls, if straightened into a single line, would extend for more than 3.5 miles. The precision of its construction, measured against perfect geometric forms, reveals deviations so small that early surveyors attributed them to their own measurement error, rather than to any imprecision in the original construction. But the most remarkable thing about the octagon is not its shape or its size. It is its orientation. Because the octagon does not sit randomly in the landscape. It is aligned, with a precision that took researchers decades to fully appreciate, to a specific phenomenon in the sky, a phenomenon that requires 18.5 years of patient, multi-generational observation just to identify. The moon, not the daily rising and setting of the moon, which anyone can observe. Not the monthly cycle from new moon to full moon and back. Something far more subtle, far more difficult to detect, and far more significant, the lunar standstill. Most people know that the sun rises at slightly different points on the horizon throughout the year. Farther north in summer, farther south in winter, with the equinoxes marking the midpoints of that annual journey. This cycle forms the basis of nearly every ancient calendar system ever discovered. The moon does something similar, but across a much longer timescale. The moon's rising point on the horizon also migrates north and south, but its cycle takes not 1 year, but 18.6 years to complete. At its northernmost extreme, called the major lunar standstill, the moon rises at a point so far north of due east that it is clearly distinct from its behavior at other points in the cycle. To notice this, to track it, to understand it as a cycle rather than an anomaly, requires observing the moon's behavior for at least one complete 18.6-year cycle. To encode it into architecture with precision requires understanding it well enough to predict where the moon will rise years into the future. The octagon at Newark is aligned to the major northern lunar standstill. The long axis of the enclosure points directly toward the point on the horizon where the moon rises at its most extreme northern position in its 18.6-year cycle. This is not approximate. It is not close. It is the kind of precision that, when astronomer Ray Hively and philosopher Robert Horne first documented it in the 1980s, made them recheck their calculations several times before they trusted the result. The implications are considerable. The Hopewell people did not simply notice the lunar standstill. They understood it well enough to build it into a 4-square-mile earthwork complex, to orient that complex with a precision that modern astronomical instruments confirm, and presumably, to use that alignment for ceremonial or calendrical purposes across generations. They observed the sky for at least 18.5 years before they could have been confident enough to build. And then, they built with an accuracy that speaks to extraordinary patience, a multi-generational commitment to careful observation that our own distracted culture finds almost impossible to imagine. Stand inside the octagon today, or rather, stand at its edge, since the interior is now occupied by a golf course, and try to imagine what that alignment meant 2,000 years ago. Once every 18.6 years, the moon rises in perfect alignment with the long axis of the enclosure. It clears the walls at a specific point, at a specific angle, in a way that happens once in less than 2 decades, and then is gone. If you knew it was coming, if your grandparents had watched for it, and their grandparents before them, and they had told you what to watch for and when, you could plan for it. You could gather people from hundreds of miles away. You could walk the great Hopewell Road in procession. You could arrive at Newark for the night, when the moon did what it only does once in 18 years. That gathering, those people walking from across a continent to stand inside a geometric miracle and watch the sky do something their grandparents had predicted, tells us something about the nature of what the Hopewell had built. It was not just an architecture, it was a system of knowledge, and the objects buried inside that system reveal how far that knowledge reached. Astronomy is one of the oldest sciences, but it did not begin in Greece, did not begin in Babylon, did not begin in the written traditions that Western civilization typically traces when it reconstructs the history of human understanding of the sky. It began wherever human beings looked up and began to notice that the lights above them moved in patterns, that the patterns were consistent, that the patterns could be learned, tracked, and eventually predicted. What makes this simple fact so disruptive to conventional historical narratives is the corollary it implies. Sophisticated astronomical knowledge does not require writing. It does not require metal instruments. It does not require a formal institution called a university or a profession called astronomer. It requires observation, memory, and transmission. The willingness to watch the sky with attention across years and decades, and to teach the next generation what you have seen. The Hopewell had all of those things, and the evidence suggests they had them at a level of sophistication that commands genuine respect. The 18.6-year lunar cycle is not the only astronomical alignment at Newark. Researchers have identified alignments to the major southern lunar standstill, to the lunar minimum, the point in the cycle when the moon's range of rising positions is at its narrowest, and to the positions of sunrise and sunset at the equinoxes. The Newark complex, in other words, appears to function as a comprehensive lunar calendar, a physical device built into the landscape that could be used to track and predict the moon's movements across its entire 18.6-year cycle, not just at the dramatic standstill moments. This is a remarkable claim, but it is a claim supported by careful mathematical analysis of the earthwork's actual dimensions and orientations, performed by multiple independent researchers using modern surveying instruments. The alignments are real. The question is what to make of them. One thing worth noting is why the moon, specifically, might have been the central object of Hopewell astronomical attention. The sun's annual cycle is relatively easy to observe. The solstices announce themselves through the dramatic length of day and night, and the equinoxes can be identified with a year or two of careful watching. The moon's 18.6-year cycle is far more subtle. It requires sustained attention across a human generation to even identify as a cycle, let alone to track with precision. Why go to the trouble? One answer may lie in agriculture. Corn, which the Hopewell grew, though it was not yet the staple crop it would become for later cultures, is sensitive to timing in ways that a reliable calendar helps manage. But the 18.6-year lunar standstill is too infrequent to serve as an ordinary agricultural calendar. Something else was at stake. Another answer may lie in ritual. Many indigenous North American traditions associate the moon with cycles of birth, death, and renewal, with the passage of time in its deepest sense, with the movement of souls between the living world and whatever comes after. If the Hopewell shared something like this cosmology, then the major lunar standstill, the moment when the moon reaches the extreme limit of its journey and begins to turn back, may have carried profound spiritual significance, a moment of cosmic boundary, a moment when whatever exists beyond the ordinary world comes as close as it ever gets. Building a 4-square-mile earthwork aligned to that moment would then make a particular kind of sense. It would be building a door, a threshold, a place designed to be the meeting point of the lunar cycle and human ceremony, a place to be at when the sky does its most extraordinary thing, because being there at that moment, in that geometry, with that alignment overhead, might open something that ordinary time and ordinary space cannot. The platform pipes found in the burial mounds reinforce this interpretation. Many represent creatures that exist at the boundaries of worlds, birds that travel between earth and sky, otters and frogs that move between land and water, snakes whose bodies connect the surface of the earth to whatever lies beneath it. The lunar standstill may have been, in the Hopewell cosmological imagination, another kind of boundary. And Newark was built to stand at that boundary, to mark it, to use it. There is something deeply moving about this interpretation, and something worth sitting with carefully. The people who built Newark did not know their civilization would eventually disappear. They did not know their earthworks would be partially destroyed by modern construction, partially occupied by a golf course, partially erased by the ordinary march of American development. They built for permanence, the permanence of Earth, which resists better than stone against the Ohio freeze-thaw cycles. They built something they expected to last, and in the most essential sense, it did, because the alignments are still there. The relationship between the octagon and the lunar standstill still holds 2,000 years later, because the moon still moves in its 18.6-year cycle, and the earthworks, despite erosion, despite development, despite centuries of neglect, still point where they were built to point. The sky still does what the Hopewell recorded it doing. The geometry still functions. Imagine lying on the ground inside the octagon during a major lunar standstill. The earthen walls rise around you in 8 directions, framing the sky above into a specific geometric view. And then, on the appointed night, the moon rises at exactly the point the walls were built to frame, rising over the gap between 2 walls precisely as the architects intended, thousands of years before you were born. The dead, who were buried nearby, saw the same thing. Their grandchildren saw the same thing. And if the earthworks survive, if the walls hold, if the alignment is not destroyed, then grandchildren not yet born will see it again. But this was only one layer of what the Hopewell built. Beneath the surface of the ceremonial landscape, in the burial chambers that archaeologists have excavated with increasing care over the past century, lies evidence of something that transforms the Newark earthworks from a local wonder into a node in a network so vast it dwarfs almost anything else in the ancient Americas. Open a burial mound in the Hopewell heartland, carefully, properly, with archaeological rigor and the consultation of descendant communities, and you encounter a paradox. You are in Ohio, you are in the 1st or 2nd century AD, and you are looking at objects that, by any rational accounting, should not be there. Obsidian, black, glassy, volcanic. The nearest source is Yellowstone, the massive volcanic field in what is now Wyoming, 1,500 miles away, across some of the most challenging terrain on the continent. Yet Hopewell burial mounds contain obsidian artifacts in quantities that suggest not a rare and treasured single piece, traded hand to hand across a dozen communities over generations, but regular access to a supply. Thousands of obsidian artifacts have been recovered from Hopewell contexts. Chemical analysis traces them with geological precision to specific volcanic sources in the Yellowstone region. Copper, pure, native copper, hammered cold into sheets and worked into remarkable forms. Headdresses, ceremonial axes, geometric cutouts, effigies of birds, and abstract symbols. The primary source, the Keweenaw Peninsula of present-day Michigan, on the southern shore of Lake Superior, more than 500 miles north of the Ohio earthworks. The Hopewell used copper in quantities that suggest reliable, repeated access to Lake Superior sources across generations. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica, thin, translucent, almost magical in the way it catches light. From the mountains of North Carolina, Hundreds of miles to the southeast, grizzly bear teeth, from animals that lived west of the Mississippi, shark teeth and barracuda jaws, from the Atlantic coast and the Gulf, galena, a silvery lead mineral, from specific geological formations in Illinois and Iowa, meteoric iron, from falls scattered across the continent, all of it in Ohio, all of it 2,000 years ago, all of it buried with the dead, as though these objects from the far ends of the continent were natural accompaniments to a person's passage into whatever came next. The Hopewell interaction sphere, the name archaeologists give to the trade network that produced this remarkable pattern, is one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the pre-Columbian history of North America. It was not an empire. The Hopewell did not appear to have conquered neighboring peoples, did not send armies to secure their trade routes, did not establish administrative centers beyond the Ohio heartland. What they built was something more subtle and, in some ways, more impressive. A network of relationships maintained through shared ceremonial practice, shared material culture, shared artistic traditions, and the exchange of objects that carried meaning far beyond their material value. Think of it this way. When a person in a community in present-day Illinois 2,000 years ago acquired a piece of Ohio pipestone and had it carved into a platform pipe in a specific Hopewell style, they were not simply acquiring a trade good, they were acquiring membership in something. The pipe placed them within a symbolic system, a shared language of forms and meanings that connected them to people in Ohio and Michigan and Louisiana and North Carolina who used the same symbolic vocabulary, built the same ceremonial forms, buried the same categories of sacred objects. The Hopewell interaction sphere was, in this sense, something like a religion without a church, or rather, with hundreds of churches scattered across the eastern half of North America, all speaking the same ceremonial language and all connected by the movement of specific, meaningful objects between them. The logistics of this system are staggering to contemplate. Moving significant quantities of obsidian from Yellowstone to Ohio, by human effort alone, means either a continuous relay of small quantities passing through many hands over many communities and many years, or organized expeditions traveling enormous distances with specific purposes and specific destinations. The evidence suggests both patterns may have been at work at different times and for different materials. Some researchers have proposed that the Ohio earthworks themselves served as the destination, that the pilgrimage road and the ceremonial centers were specifically designed to draw people from across the continent, creating a regular gathering at which the exchange of sacred materials could occur in a ritual context that transformed trade into ceremony. Newark as a kind of fair, in the deepest religious sense of that word, a gathering place where distance collapsed, where people from a dozen different communities and cultures could come together around shared practice. The material evidence supports this interpretation in interesting ways. The exotic objects found in Hopewell burial mounds are not randomly distributed. They cluster around high-status individuals, people who appear, from the elaborateness of their burials and the concentration of rare objects around them, to have held specific social roles. Some researchers interpret these individuals as ritual specialists, ceremonial leaders, or spiritual intermediaries, people whose social power derived precisely from their role in maintaining the network, conducting the ceremonies, and managing the exchange of sacred objects. In a society without hereditary monarchy in the conventional sense, without professional armies, without a taxation system backed by coercive force. The Hopewell appear to have maintained continental-scale social cohesion through something else entirely: the management of meaning. The people at the center of the network were powerful because they controlled access to the symbols, the objects, the ceremonies, and the places that gave life its deepest significance across an enormous geographic range. That is an extraordinary form of power, and it is a form of power that, by its very nature, is extremely vulnerable to certain kinds of disruption. Because meaning-based authority depends on the continued relevance of the meaning system. If the ceremonies stop drawing pilgrims, if the sacred objects lose their significance, if the shared cosmological framework fractures across the distances that separate the communities it once connected, the network weakens, and with it, the social structures built around it. Imagine the journey of a single piece of obsidian, chipped from a volcanic outcrop near Yellowstone, by a person who has made this trip specifically for that purpose, who has walked, perhaps, for months, navigating terrain they have never seen before, using knowledge passed down through generations of travelers who made the same journey. The obsidian is carried east, across the Missouri River plains, through forests that grow denser as the elevation drops and the rainfall increases, across the Ohio River to a ceremonial center where it will be worked into a specific form and eventually placed in a burial mound alongside the remains of a person whose ritual role required this specific, extraordinary material. Every step of that journey is intentional. Every hand that touched the obsidian along the way was part of a system, and that system connected the volcanic heart of the continent to the river valleys of Ohio, across more than 1,500 miles of varied and often difficult terrain, for centuries. But the most remarkable things the Hopewell buried were not the exotic trade goods from distant places, as extraordinary as those are. The most remarkable things were the ideas encoded in those burials, ideas about what death means, about what the world is, about where the living and the dead meet, and what happens when they do. The burial mounds were not simply tombs. They were, in the most precise sense possible, portals. And understanding what the Hopewell believed about those portals means descending into the cosmological world that the earthworks were built to express. There are 3 layers to the world. In many indigenous North American cosmological traditions, there is the world above, the sky, the celestial realm, the domain of great spirits and celestial forces. There is the world of ordinary human experience, the surface of the earth, the landscape of rivers and forests and seasons. And there is the world below, the underworld, the domain of the dead, of transformation, of the forces that move beneath the visible surface of things. These 3 worlds are not entirely separate. They communicate, they influence each other, and certain places, certain times, certain objects, and certain rituals can thin the boundary between them, can open a passage through which communication, power, or transformation can flow. The Hopewell built their world on this understanding, and the most direct evidence for that claim lies inside the burial mounds, in the extraordinary care with which the dead were prepared for their passage, and in the objects chosen to accompany them. The platform pipes deserve particular attention here. These carved stone pipes, some of the most technically and artistically sophisticated objects produced anywhere in ancient North America, are not simply beautiful, they are specific. The animals represented on them are not random. They are creatures chosen for their symbolic resonance with the boundaries between worlds. The otter, a master of both land and water, comfortable in both realms, a creature that crosses the boundary between surface and depth with ease. The raven, a creature of both earth and sky, associated in many traditions with the world of the dead. The hawk, a skyward creature, associated with the upper world, with the celestial forces that govern the earth below. The pipes were used ceremonially, smoking tobacco or other plant materials in rituals designed to facilitate communication with other realms, to move intentionally between the three worlds of the Hopewell cosmological map. And then, when the person who held this ritual role died, the pipe went with them, into the mound, into the underworld. Because the pipe was not simply an object, it was a tool for crossing boundaries, and the person who carried it across the final boundary needed it for the journey. The copper, too, carries specific symbolic weight. In many indigenous traditions, copper is associated with the upper world, with celestial fire, with the power of the sun, with the forces that govern the sky. Burying copper with the dead places the force of the upper world in the underworld, creates a connection, a channel, a piece of sky carried down into the earth. The freshwater pearls carry similar associations in different registers. The mica, thin, luminous, almost mirror-like, may have represented the reflective surface of water, the boundary between the world above and the world below. Every object in the burial is a symbol. Every symbol is a tool. And every tool is part of an argument, a carefully constructed material statement about what the world is, how its layers connect, and what death means within that cosmological framework. The mounds themselves are the grandest part of that argument. They rise from the earth, deliberately, carefully, at the expense of enormous human effort, and they bury their contents in darkness and earth and time. But they also mark the burial site permanently in the landscape, creating a physical reminder that the dead are present, that the underworld lies beneath the surface, that the boundary between the living world and the world below is here, at this place, marked by this hill of earth. Some of the burial ceremonies the Hopewell conducted appear, from the archaeological evidence, to have been extraordinary events. At certain sites, evidence suggests that large wooden charnel houses were built, used for extended periods of preparation of the dead, and then burned, deliberately, completely, before the burial mound was raised over the ash and remains. The burning was not destruction, it was transformation. Fire as the agent of passage from one state to another, one world to another. The scale of some of these ceremonies is breathtaking. At the Mound City complex in Ohio, a group of burial mounds sits within a large ceremonial enclosure. Excavation revealed that at some point in their history, the original wooden structures were burned, and the mounds raised over the ruins. The objects recovered from those mounds include some of the finest Hopewell artifacts ever found, suggesting that the ceremonies associated with these burials were among the most significant events in Hopewell ritual life, drawing the most important participants, involving the most sacred objects, marking the deaths of the most ritually significant individuals. There is a deep humanity in all of this, a recognizable emotional reality beneath the strangeness of the specific cultural forms. The Hopewell cared for their dead with extraordinary attention. They marked those deaths with beautiful, meaningful objects. They built permanent monuments above the graves so that the dead would not be forgotten, so that their presence would continue to shape the landscape of the living. These are not alien impulses. They are, in some form, universal ones. What is perhaps most striking about the Hopewell mortuary tradition is how it united the cosmic and the intimate, how it placed the individual human death within a framework that encompassed the movements of the moon, the distances to the edges of the continent, the symbolic vocabulary of the three-layered universe. The person buried in a Hopewell mound did not simply die, they completed a journey that the living, through their ceremonies and their constructions, had prepared the landscape to receive. But that landscape, that ceremony, that extraordinary system of meaning, held together across a continent by the movement of sacred objects and shared cosmological ideas, it did not last forever. Sometime around the 5th century AD, something changed, and what happened next remains, in some ways, the deepest mystery of all. It ends without a bang. That is the thing that makes it strange. Around 400 AD, maybe 500 AD, the dating is imprecise, as all deep archaeological dating tends to be at the margins. The Hopewell interaction sphere simply stops. The flow of exotic materials into Ohio burial mounds ceases. The construction of large geometric earthworks halts. The elaborate burial ceremonies that had defined Hopewell ritual life for centuries are no longer archaeologically visible. The pilgrimage road goes quiet. There is no clear evidence of conquest. No invading culture displaced the Hopewell from their Ohio homeland. There are no burned settlements, no mass graves, no sudden appearance of a new material culture replacing the old one with the kind of sharp discontinuity that conquest typically leaves in the archaeological record. The Hopewell did not appear to be destroyed. They appeared to simply stop. Researchers have proposed several explanations, none of them definitively proven, all of them interesting. One possibility is climatic. The period between roughly 300 and 600 AD saw significant climate variability across much of eastern North America. Drought in some regions, increased flooding in others, shifts in growing seasons that would have stressed agricultural communities and disrupted the reliable food surpluses that may have underwritten the Hopewell ceremonial system. If the earthwork construction and the pilgrimage system required sustained food surplus to support the labor of thousands of non-productive workers, a prolonged period of agricultural stress could have gradually made that investment unsustainable. A second possibility is technological. The introduction of the bow and arrow into eastern North America appears to have occurred roughly around the same period as the Hopewell decline, and some researchers have proposed that this technological change had profound social consequences. The bow and arrow fundamentally alters the calculus of violence. It makes individual actors more dangerous at a distance. It potentially disrupts the social hierarchies that had organized Hopewell society by redistributing power in ways that favor different kinds of organization. A third possibility is internal, that the Hopewell social system contained the seeds of its own dissolution, a network held together by shared ceremonial practice and the authority of ritual specialists is inherently vulnerable to loss of faith. If the ceremonies began to seem less powerful, the specialists less authoritative, the cosmological framework less convincing, for any of 100 possible reasons, some internal to the system, some the result of external pressures, the network could unravel surprisingly quickly, Meaning-based authority has no army to fall back on when the meaning fades. What happened to the Hopewell people? They did not vanish. The populations of Ohio and the surrounding region did not disappear in the 5th century AD. People continued to live there, to farm and hunt and build communities. But those communities were different. Smaller, less interconnected, less architecturally ambitious. The Continental Web was gone. The pilgrimage road fell into disuse. The great earthworks remained, silent, no longer actively maintained, beginning the long, slow process of erosion and overgrowth that would eventually render them nearly invisible to the European settlers who arrived more than 1,000 years later. The Hopewell did not end. They transformed into something quieter, something less visible, something that the continent they had once connected in such extraordinary ways would not fully recognize again for a very long time. One failed harvest becomes survivable. One dry decade becomes difficult. Several generations of instability become something else entirely. A slow collapse of the confidence that makes large collective efforts possible. And when that confidence goes, the road goes with it. The mounds remain, but the world that gave them meaning begins to fade. There is a golf course in Newark, Ohio. The Mound Builders Country Club. The name itself is a small, accidental poem. Sits on approximately 60 acres of land that includes, within its carefully manicured fairways, the surviving portion of the Hopewell Octagon earthworks. The earthen walls of one of the most precise astronomical observatories ever built in the ancient Americas are preserved in the rough between the fairways. The alignment to the major lunar standstill runs roughly parallel to the 9th hole. This is not presented here as outrage, though it could be. The golf course's presence on the octagon is a complicated legal and historical situation, one still unfolding. Efforts to secure the site's full protection and return it to public access have made significant progress in recent years. But the image is useful. It is perhaps the most concentrated expression available of the cultural forgetting that the Hopewell story represents. Human beings built on this ground one of the most sophisticated ceremonial and astronomical complexes in the ancient world. 2,000 years later, human beings built a golf course on top of it, not out of malice, not out of awareness of what was beneath, but out of the simple, vast, almost total ignorance of what had happened here that characterized American cultural life for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries. That ignorance was not natural. It was the product of specific historical choices about what histories mattered, whose civilizations counted as civilization, what the word ancient meant, in the context of a continent whose indigenous peoples were still present and still fighting for their rights and their lives. To not know about the Hopewell was, in a deep sense, to choose not to know. Because the mounds were always there. The earthworks were always visible, at least in part. The knowledge existed. It simply wasn't absorbed into the stories Americans told themselves about who they were and where they came from. The deeper truth the Hopewell story carries is this: the history of America does not begin in 1492. It does not begin with European arrival, European documentation, European naming. It begins much earlier. And it includes civilizations of scale and sophistication that challenge every simplified narrative about what the New World was before the ships arrived. 2,000 years ago, the people of the Ohio River valleys built geometric earthworks aligned to the moon's 18.6-year cycle. They maintained trade networks stretching across a continent. They produced art of extraordinary beauty and spiritual depth. They organized, across centuries and without any of the administrative apparatus we associate with complex societies, the construction of monuments that required the coordinated effort of thousands of people working across generations toward a shared vision. They understood something about the sky, about the earth, about the relationship between them, that took the rest of the world's civilizations centuries more to approach, and they encoded that understanding in the landscape itself, in 500 million tons of moved earth, in 60 miles of impossibly straight road, in the perfect geometry of a circle and a square whose areas are equal. The geometry is still there. The alignments still work. The moon still rises every 18.6 years, exactly where the octagon points. The next major lunar standstill after this one falls in 2025. It was observed. People stood at the edge of the earthworks in the early morning dark and watched the moon rise in exactly the place that hands, working without wheels or written language or metal tools, had built to frame it 2,000 years before. They built it to last. And somehow, against 2,000 years of weather and erosion and gulf and forgetting, it did.